So, Turkish Airlines is the flag carrier and largest airline in Turkey. It's one of the largest airlines in the world. They fly to 340 destinations in 129 countries. That's more countries than any other airline, and more destinations than any other mainland carrier. The main hub for Turkish Airlines is at Istanbul International Airport, where Turkish flies to 340 destinations. That's more destinations than any other airline at a single airport. They also have operations in Ankara, the capital of Turkey, and other important cities. I think it's impressive, but I'm actually surprised not that many people are talking about it. So in this video, I want to talk about Turkish Airlines and analyze how they've managed to be so successful in recent years, including the main factors that contribute to the airline's success, as well as analyzing the airline's fleet and their route network in full detail. Obviously, this didn't start like this. In the beginning, Turkish Airlines was focused on the domestic market. Back then, the main purpose of the airline was to connect Turkey to the outside world, especially in Europe and the Middle East. But it was in the 2000s that Turkish saw the potential for Istanbul to become a major international hub. So they added more and more flights to many destinations around the world, while taking advantage of Istanbul's location in that middle point between Asia, Africa, and Europe to connect passengers from all over the world via Istanbul. Nowadays, the Turkish Airlines route network from Istanbul includes 45 domestic destinations in pretty much every single airport in Turkey, as well as around 84 destinations in Europe, but that's not including Ukraine, where Turkish used to fly to 7 cities before the war. Turkish also flies to around 30 destinations in the Middle East, 11 destinations in Northern Africa, 39 destinations in Sub-Saharan Africa, 20 destinations in Central Asia, including the Caucasus. There are 9 destinations in South Asia, 10 in Southeast Asia, and another 10 in East Asia. Also 15 destinations in the US and Canada, and 8 in Latin America. The airline's fleet is massive and it's pretty diverse. Turkish currently has 400 Boeing and Airbus aircraft of all sizes, and this brings a lot of flexibility to the airline. Turkish often swaps between different aircraft types during the week, depending on the demand and the availability of aircraft. This allows the airline to use their aircraft more efficiently. The airline's fleet as of the week of March 13, 2023 includes 400 aircraft, including 22 cargo aircraft and 68 from an Anadolu jet. The Turkish Airlines mainline fleet is made up of 310 passenger aircraft, of which 111 are wide-bodies and 199 are narrow-bodies. This includes 6 Airbus A319s that mostly fly on domestic routes that have so little demand that a larger aircraft is not feasible, as well as a larger international flight to Ganja and Nakhchivan. The 11 Airbus A320s tend to fly on domestic routes as well, but also on a few short-haul international flights that are usually operated by other aircraft. But I guess the A320s act as a substitute in case a 737 or A321 isn't available. These two aircraft types are on a single-class economy configuration. Turkish also has 65 Airbus A321-200s with different cabin configurations. These aircraft are basically the backbone of their short-haul operations, including domestic flights and most of the flights to Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. There is, though, a subfleet of A321s that have a single class that flies on less premium routes, as well as point-to-point flights like Antalya to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and Hajj flies to Jeddah and Medina. Turkish also has 39 Airbus A321neos that fly on the same routes that the A321-200 does, but they also fly on longer flights to Central Asia and Africa as well. Turkish has 40 of the Boeing 737-800s and 20 of the 737 MAX 8s, and while they have similar cabin layout, the 737-800s mostly fly to smaller cities in Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and domestic flights, while the MAX 8 flies the longer flights to Central and Western Africa, although the two types tend to overlap on European and domestic flights. Turkish has 15 of the Boeing 737-900ERs and 5 of the 737 MAX 9s. These aircraft tend to fly domestic and international short-haul routes that are too busy for the 737-800s, but not busy enough for the A321s. 13 Airbus A330-200s. They mostly fly on longer thin flights to Mongolia and Western Africa or high-demand medium to short-haul destinations in Europe and the Middle East. This includes two planes that basically fly back and forth between Istanbul and Moscow-Vnukovo. 37 Airbus A330-300s. These aircraft fly on busy short-haul flights to Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East, and some of the thinner long-haul flights to East Asia and Africa, as well as Boston, New York, and Newark. 16 of the Boeing 787-9s, with another 10 still in order. They mostly fly to medium-sized cities in North and South America and Asia. as well as many secondary frequencies on heavier routes like Mexico, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami. But they also fly in a few shorter haul flights to Europe and the Middle East. 12 of the Airbus A350-900s, plus another 14 is still on order. Turkish originally ordered 20 A350s, but Turkish took another order for 6 Airbus A350s that were meant to go to Aeroflot, but were not delivered because of sanctions. 8 of the original A350s and 4 of the Aeroflot A350s have been delivered thus far. The A350s operate routes that are too big for the smaller A330 or the 787, but too thin for the 777. It's that middle ground that includes markets like Canada, South Africa, Vietnam, and Sao Paulo, and a couple of destinations in Europe. 33 of the Boeing 777-300 ERs, 30 of which have 349 seats. They mainly fly the busiest short-haul routes like New York, Bangkok, Mexico, and Chicago, as well as some extremely busy flights to Europe and the Middle East, and even domestic flights to Ankara, Antalya, and Izmir. The three final 777s have 400 seats, and they mostly fly on the very busy flights to Delhi and Mumbai. Indigo Airlines from India currently wet leases one of these 400-seat 777s and deploys it in the Delhi to Istanbul route. As y'all can see, each different aircraft serves a different purpose, and thanks to them, the airline is able to reach so many places that would have otherwise been out of reach. Turkish has many advantages that help them succeed, of which geography is probably the biggest one of them. Istanbul is perfectly located between three continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Istanbul has historically been a very important logistics hub connecting east and west, with many trade routes passing through the city, whether it was by ocean or land. Turkish uses this to their advantage by connecting a lot of places around the world, such as, for example, Europe to Asia, Europe to Africa, Asia to Africa, North America to Asia and Africa, South America to Asia, and many more. Backtracking is also pretty common in many connections, such as North America to Europe and Northern Africa, because Turkish sometimes offers cheaper fares than many direct flights to Europe. The location of Istanbul also allows the airline to access many countries more easily with short-haul narrow-body aircraft that are much cheaper to operate and much easier to fill than large wide-bodies. The Boeing 737 MAX 8, for example, can reach all of Europe, most of Central Asia, and a big chunk of Africa, including a lot of underserved markets that Emirates, Qatar, Ethiopian, and other airlines can't access that easily because they often have to rely on wide bodies. These smaller aircraft also allowed the airline to fly to many underserved markets with limited international service, especially in Africa and Central Asia. Turkish connects these underserved markets to the rest of the world via Istanbul. Something that I haven't mentioned is that Turkish Airlines flies a lot of triangular one-stop and fifth freedom flights. This is more commonly seen in Africa and Latin America. Turkish may be able to operate some of these flights non-stop, but that would mean fewer frequencies. Turkish would rather fly to these places several times a week or daily with one stop on these flights. Turkish knows there's little competition on a lot of these destinations, so having a stop on these flights doesn't make them any less competitive. But unlike places like Europe, where small cities tend to have a lot more competition from local airlines. But in Africa, that's simply not the case. Just take a look at how many of their flights to Africa are one-stop flights. Turkish depends a lot on connecting flights to support their massive expansion, but we can't negate the importance of the local demand in Turkey as well, and there's a lot of it. Turkey is a big country. It has a population of 84 million. Turkish flies to 45 Turkish cities from Istanbul, where local passengers can connect onto many international flights, while they also fly a lot of point-to-point flights from multiple cities in Turkey. Meanwhile, Istanbul has a population of 15 million, making it the largest city in Turkey and the largest in Europe. It's also the main economic hub in the country and a very important logistics hub and tourist destination, all of which brings a lot of demand into the city. Tourism is also pretty big in Turkey. Istanbul, along cities like Antalya, Bodrum, and Dalaman, are also very popular among European tourists, more notably Russia, which is the largest tourism market in the country. Many of these flights are point-to-point flights operated by Turkish Airlines' local subsidiary Anadolujet. And if there isn't a direct flight, one can always transfer at Istanbul. There's also a very large Turkish diaspora outside of Turkey, especially in Germany, where Turkish people make up the largest minority group in the country, so Turkish flies to 11 cities. Other places that have a large Turkish population include the UK, Austria, the Netherlands, and many other European countries, as well as the US, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. So Turkish offers a lot of flights to these places, including several point-to-point flights. It's actually great to see how Turkish Airlines managed to find a balance between local demand and connecting traffic. which makes the airline more successful than many that rely solely on local demand and others that rely only on connecting passengers. But none of this expansion would have been possible without the construction of Istanbul's massive new airport, which was opened in 2019 and built to replace the congested Ataturk International Airport, which wasn't able to expand because it was surrounded by the city on all sides. At the same time, Sabiha Gökçen Airport is getting a second runway to support the expansion of Anadolu Jet and Pegasus. Another factor that helps Turkish is, well, the lack of competition. While most European flag carriers tend to have a lot of competition at their main hubs, Turkish has little competition at Istanbul, where they hold 80% of the market share. Sure, there are other airlines flying to Istanbul, but it's nothing compared to Turkish Airlines' mega hub at the airport. Turkish Airlines' main local competitor is Pegasus Air, which is based at Sabiha Gökçen, although they compete more with Anadolu Jet rather than Turkish itself, since they operate more point-to-point and shorter haul flights. But Turkish also has a lot of indirect competition from other airlines, especially those in the Middle East and Europe. But Turkish has many advantages over those airlines. First of all, Turkish flies to a lot more countries than any other airline, far ahead of second place Air France. And at the same time, Turkish flies to a lot of airports where Qatar and Emirates don't fly, especially in Europe and North and South America, that are closer in distance to Istanbul. They also fly to more cities in Africa than any airline in the Middle East or in Europe. Heck, they even fly to a couple of African cities where Ethiopia doesn't fly. Meanwhile, in most of Asia, it's Emirates, Qatar, and Singapore that dominate because their hubs are far closer to these regions. But that doesn't mean that Turkish is failing in Asia, because they have a competitive advantage over European airlines that don't fly to nearly as many Asian destinations, especially now that many European airlines have to avoid Russian airspace because of the sanctions. In order to expand their market share, Turkish also has several subsidiaries that enable Turkish to compete more easily with other airlines, especially with Pegasus Air. The first one is Anadolujet, a local subsidiary fully owned by Turkish Airlines. Their main hubs are Istanbul and Sabiha Gökçen Airport on the Asian side of the city, as well as Ankara. With a lot of domestic and international flights to many European destinations, this airline works as an alternative for those living in Istanbul, and it helps Turkish compete with Pegasus Air, which is also based at Sabiha Gökçen. The other subsidiary is Sun Express. This is a joint venture between Turkish Airlines and Lufthansa, on which each airline owns a 50% stake. Most of their flights are between Germany and Turkey, but they also fly to other cities in Europe and the Middle East from Turkey. These subsidiaries were created in an attempt to capture more of the leisure demand in the country and much of the domestic market share outside of Istanbul. Turkish Cargo is a cargo subsidiary of Turkish Airlines that operates cargo flights to destinations all over the world with their fleet of Boeing 777s, Airbus A310s, and A330 freighter aircraft as far as North and South America and as near as Asia, Europe, or Africa. For a while, Turkish Cargo operated only out of Ataturk Airport in Istanbul, but has recently moved all its operations to the new airport to better connect with the airline's mainline operations. Turkish also has a lot of partner airlines that allow them to reach a lot more destinations than the ones they already fly to. You see, in some markets they can do fine with just the local demand and connections at Istanbul, but there are places that may not have enough demand to fill a plane. Some might have the demand, but Turkish may not have the planes to fly the route, while some cities are just too far for a direct flight from Istanbul. And that's where the kosher agreements help. The list of kosher agreements is massive. This includes members of the Star Alliance, which Turkish joined in 2008, but also other independent airlines and some that are part of other alliances. Some partner airlines allow Turkish to access smaller cities in their respective countries, such as United Airlines, Air Canada, UT Air, Malaysia Airlines, and others. Other airlines provide international connections, such as Ethiopian Airlines in Africa, Copa Airlines in Latin America, Singapore Airlines to Australia, and others. Meanwhile, other airlines fly to Istanbul to take advantage of the many connections that Turkish Airlines offers. This usually pays off for Turkish, because Turkish doesn't have to fly their own planes to some of these places, while they benefit from the connecting traffic these airlines bring. Some examples include airlines like Air Astana, Uzbekistan Airlines, Air Serbia, and Belavia. One interesting cultural agreement that Turkish has is that with Hawaiian Airlines, on which Turkish passengers can connect onto Hawaiian Airlines at US airports like LAX and San Francisco. But you can also fly via Asian hubs like Seoul and Tokyo, which I think is pretty interesting. Now, I want to talk about some of the more important markets for Turkish and why they're so important for them. I honestly think they're all very important, but I'm only going to go over a few of them. In Europe, the biggest market is Germany, where Turkish flies to 11 cities, thanks to all the tourism and large Turkish population in Germany. The UK is also very important, especially London, where Turkish flies 5 times a day to Heathrow and twice a day to Gatwick. Turkish helps out in several markets that have few, if any, flights outside of Europe, such as the Balkans and Eastern Europe, while also helping out Western Europe with flights to Asia and Africa. Ukraine is an interesting case for obvious reasons. Ukraine relied heavily on Turkish Airlines for their international connections before the 2022 invasion. Turkish flew to 7 cities in Ukraine before they were suspended in 2022. Donetsk and Simferopol had already been suspended when the war started in 2014. Speaking of the devil, Turkish currently flies to 3 airports in Russia as well as Minsk in Belarus. They used to fly to 9 destinations from Istanbul before the pandemic, but many are currently suspended. Turkish is definitely taking advantage of the sanctions that prohibit Russian airlines from flying to many Western countries. So Turkish has multiple flights a day to Moscow, and that's not even including all the Russian airlines that fly to Istanbul from many cities in Russia. It's almost like Istanbul has become Russia's international hub, because from Istanbul you can basically fly almost anywhere, including a lot of tourist destinations that Russians love so much in Turkey, the Middle East, South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In the Middle East, Turkish flies to multiple cities in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. But other countries like Israel, Jordan, and Qatar also have a lot of demand because of tourism and because of business thanks to oil. The other countries in Northern Africa have a large Turkish diaspora, but there's also a lack of direct flights to Asia and other places from there. While there's also a lot of demand to North America and Europe that transits through Istanbul, plus a lot of travel between these countries and Turkey. In sub-Saharan Africa, most countries have very limited flights outside of Africa. Many African airlines are falling apart, and there aren't enough flights to meet the demand, even in places with loads of demand like Nigeria and South Africa. Turkish flies to many of these countries and provides them with connections at Istanbul. Turkish also gains access to destinations they don't fly to thanks to Ethiopian Airlines, which offers connections at Addis Ababa. Turkish flies to nearly every country in Central Asia and the Caucasus. I'm also going to include Mongolia in here as well. All of these countries have close ties with Russia and have multiple flights a day to Moscow and other cities in Russia. But outside of Russia, there aren't really that many connections in comparison. Sure, they got a few flights to Europe and Asia, but Turkish offers a lot more connections in Europe and North America for them. In South Asia, the most important markets are Pakistan, which doesn't have many connections since PIA was banned in the EU and the US. Meanwhile, in India, Turkish could easily fly to multiple cities if they wanted to. But Turkey and India don't really get along, so their flights are limited to just Delhi and Mumbai. Southeast Asia has a lot of tourist destinations that are very popular among Europeans in Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and others. But there is also a lot of business demand, especially in Singapore, which is an important financial and business hub where passengers can connect onto flights to Australia. These places are so far from Europe that direct flights aren't always possible, so Turkish provides connections. And I'm sure there is some demand from North America and Africa coming in through Istanbul as well. Then there's China, which is a mess because of the Rona, and a lot of their flights are suspended, but Turkish Airlines flies to several cities, including Hong Kong. Plus, Turkish also flies to Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which are also very important business hubs. There is also a lot of demand between Europe and East Asia, but these flights also carry a lot of passengers from Africa, South America, and obviously Turkey, especially now that European, Japanese, and Korean airlines aren't allowed to fly over Russia, which Turkish doesn't really have to do. Turkish flies to 3 cities in Canada and 12 in the United States. There's a lot of business travel and tourism coming to and from North America, as well as a large foreign population from many cities around the world. Finally, Turkish has 8 destinations in Latin America, including 3 different triangular flights to 6 cities, as well as flights to Buenos Aires with a stop in Sao Paulo. Turkish also has an additional non-stop flight to Panama City and Caracas, separate from the triangular flights via Havana and Bogota. The main connecting markets for these cities include, of course, China, but also the likes of South Asia, the Middle East, and Russia. And while these are all the markets that Turkish flies to, 129 countries, but what are the countries where Turkish doesn't fly? And why don't they fly to these countries? The most obvious ones are Australia, New Zealand, and the many small islands in the Pacific. They're simply way too far, and many of these countries are way too small to justify a flight there. Although Turkish is currently planning to begin flights to Sydney in the coming years. Otherwise, Turkish can access them via Singapore and other airports. There's also the small countries in Europe that are too small and have no airport, although Turkish often flies to nearby airports anyway. There are several countries in the Americas as well that are too small to justify a direct flight to Istanbul, while some of them are simply too far and Turkish may not have the aircraft to operate these flights, but they can be reached via Panama and Copa Airlines. Turkish used to fly to Slovakia, but since Vienna is close by, passengers can probably just drive or take a train to Bratislava. In the case of Albania, Turkish owns 49% of Air Albania, so they fly the Istanbul to Tirana flight instead. Iceland may have little demand, but it's pretty far compared to the rest of Europe, so other markets might be a much bigger priority. There's also Myanmar, where Turkish could easily fly on an A330, but it may not have as much demand as other nearby markets. The same probably applies to nearby Laos and Cambodia. Meanwhile, Bhutan has an airport but doesn't have enough passengers to justify a flight to Istanbul. It's usually better to transit via Delhi or Bangkok. Turkish has no flights to Armenia despite being right next to Turkey, likely because of the hostility between the two countries, but Pegasus Airlines operates the route from Sabiha Gökçen. Turkish doesn't fly to the Republic of Cyprus, but they do fly to northern Cyprus, which is not internationally recognized. To fly from Istanbul to Cyprus, it's better to travel via Athens or other European hubs. In Africa, there's obviously several countries that are too small, such as Lesotho and Eswatini, while other countries in Western, Central, and Southern Africa may have the demand but are simply too far, and it may be hard to operate these flights profitably. But Turkish manages to access these countries via Addis Ababa on Ethiopian Airlines anyway, and if not with Ethiopian, they can be accessed via Casablanca or Lisbon. And finally, there are other countries where Turkish doesn't fly to because of war and conflict. Ukraine is impossible at the moment. Turkish doesn't fly to Libya, but several Libyan airlines fly to Istanbul from several cities. Yemen and Syria can be accessed via Jordan, and I might as well include North Korea, which can be accessed via Beijing. Now, I've talked about the markets that Turkish already flies to, but they're not stopping there. There are a lot of markets that Turkish could target in the future as they keep growing. So, what are they? Well, they're going to be starting flights later this year to Krakow, Poland, and Palermo in Italy, as well as Luanda in Zambia with a stop in Dar es Salaam. They will also resume flights to Afghanistan, I think. Turkish also mentioned a list of 28 cities they want to target in the coming years, including Denver, Detroit, and Orlando in the US, and others like Newcastle, Brazzaville, Hargeisa, and others, as well as some possible one-stop flights like Santiago via Rio de Janeiro, as well as Phnom Penh via Penang, and maybe Monrovia via Lomé. Now, one of the biggest routes that Turkish has hinted at is the flight from Istanbul to Sydney, Australia, for which I've actually seen articles dating back to around 2013. This route would actually be pretty successful if done right, especially with all the connections that Turkish offers at Istanbul to Europe. But I'm sure it's not easy to plan a flight this long. It would be the second longest flight behind Singapore to Newark, and it will not be easy to fly non-stop with a full payload with the current aircraft. It is likely that this route may be flown with a stop in Southeast Asia, but that is unsure at the moment. Turkish is taking their time to plan these future flights to avoid any operational difficulties. Besides Sydney, I could also see Melbourne, Auckland, and Perth being added later on. Turkish could probably also look towards other secondary cities like, for example, Dresden, Reykjavik, and Palma de Mallorca in Europe, Yangon, Vientiane, and Nagoya in Asia, as well as resuming flights to secondary cities in Russia. They could also begin flights to more cities in India, assuming they get the approval, but if not, then Indigo could fly these routes instead. In Africa, they could break up some one-stop and triangular flights and add new ones like Bissau, Harare, and Windhoek. In North America, I can actually see new flights to Las Vegas, Philadelphia, and Minneapolis, for example. Maybe Calgary in Canada, but who knows? I'm even thinking of other cities in Latin America and the Caribbean like Punta Cana, Lima, and Quito. But in order to carry out such a big expansion, more aircraft are needed, and Turkish is already struggling to add new flights because of the lack of deliveries from Boeing, which has led to the purchase of Aeroflot's A350s and the postponement of the flights to Denver and Detroit. They still have another 57 Airbus A321neos on order that will support this short to medium haul expansion as well as increasing frequencies on current flights. They also have another 10 of the Boeing 787-9s on order and 14 of the Airbus A350-900s that will help with their long haul expansion. I'd say it's possible that Turkish orders back some of the 737 MAX 8 and MAX 9s in the future, although I'm not actually sure how likely that is. Probably once the A321neo deliveries are completed, they could also order some of the Airbus A220-300, which can actually help replace the older A319s and increase frequencies on existing routes. On the wide-body side, I'd say Turkish should order some of the Boeing 787-10 to operate some of the short-haul flights operated by the A330s, 787s, and 777s. Some of the longer flights to the east coast of North America could also be flown by this, although I'd rather see the A350s on those flights instead, while the 787-10 operates the shorter ones. The Boeing 787-10 could also be a replacement for the A330s once they reach retirement age. The Boeing 777X could be a long-term replacement for the Boeing 777-300ER, although this aircraft may be too large for the airline, and they could order something like the A350-1000 instead in order to complement the Boeing 777-300ER as a higher capacity aircraft that could possibly fly on some of the busiest routes like India, London, and the US. I think the extended range version of the Boeing 787-9 that Boeing is planning to make would be perfect for the airline, since it could reach destinations that currently need a stopover, such as Mexico City and Buenos Aires, or new destinations such as Sydney, Melbourne, and Lima. In the end, I really don't know what they're going to be doing in the future. I don't know what aircraft they're going to order or what destinations they're going to add. It will all depend on what the airline needs. After all, they know what they want and they know what works for them. While I'm just a guy with a computer telling my observations on why the airline is so big and successful and speculating on what they may be doing in the coming years, it's actually great how they have managed to take advantage of their full potential with one of the best locations in a country with already tons of local demand, with all the connecting possibilities that they have, and therefore making it the huge airline that we all know today, and that hopefully will keep growing even more in the coming years. Thank y'all for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. If y'all got any questions, comments, or any feedback, y'all can leave a comment. I also made a Twitter that y'all can follow if y'all wish. I post about airline analysis, new route developments, and cool stuff over there. I also have an Instagram that y'all can follow where I post some cool stories and I post some plain pictures every now and then, so go ahead and check them out. Anyway, that's all good to say, and I'll see y'all later.